COVID-19 and then the Ukraine war. Of course, they are taking their toll on the economic prospects, the global economic prospects, and I'm very pleased and honored today to make a sort of health check on a global economy with the Nobel laureate, here we are, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, professor at the Columbia University. Professor, it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Without further ado, I immediately leave the floor to you. Please, Professor.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. In the few minutes I have, let me talk about two major issues. The first represents a set of issues between the developed and the less developed countries. As we all know, we've just been going through a terrible pandemic. It is a triumph of modern science that we were able to so quickly detect the pathogen that was causing the disease and to develop the vaccine that could keep it under control. Those innovations, those scientific breakthroughs were based on a long history of publicly supported research, for instance, that led to the mRNA platform. Unfortunately, the public-private partnership that succeeded in bringing the vaccine to market and making the vaccine available to everybody in the advanced countries effectively broke down when it came to the developing countries. There was what has been called vaccine apartheid. It was a foolish kind of apartheid, a foolish kind of inequality, because while the disease continued to fester in any part of the world, it provided opportunities for mutations to develop a mutant that was more contagious, more deadly, more vaccine resistant. So it was in the interest of the advanced countries to make sure that everybody was quickly vaccinated. But unfortunately, the advanced countries put the interests of the big pharmaceutical companies above the interests of the world, and including those in the developing countries. They put profits over lives. 2 years ago, South Africa and India asked for a waiver of the intellectual property rights related to COVID-19. Eventually, we succeeded in persuading President Biden to support a vaccine waiver. We were disappointed that he didn't support a broader waiver, but at least he supported a vaccine waiver. But Germany, Switzerland, UK, and some other European countries resisted. They said profits are more important than lives. And in the WTO ministerial that was just held in Geneva, the trade ministers of the world again refused to adopt a COVID-19 intellectual property waiver, again, putting profits over lives. If we can't get a global cooperation on something that is of such vital interest to all of us, is in our own self-interest, it makes me very worried about whether we can get global cooperation in other areas that are also vital, including climate change. This kind of inequity that we've just experienced has been manifest in many other aspects of the international architecture being discussed at the G20. One of the hopeful advances that was made in earlier G20 meetings was an agreement to enact a global minimum tax on multilateral corporations, multinational corporations. But as the expression goes, the devil is in the detail. And when the countries got together, the agenda, the discussion was dominated by the advanced countries. And the result of that was an agreement that benefited to a very little extent the developing countries. They had to forego their rights to digital taxation in return for getting more rights, but very circumscribed rights in other aspects of taxation of the multinationals. The whole framework was very unbalanced. Of course, now with the difficulty of getting that agreement enacted in the United States, the whole thing may be scuttled. So that's the first issue I wanted to raise, these inequities, even when reducing these inequities would be in the interest of the advanced countries, these inequities that seem to persist. The second issue is the new Cold War. The world is once again becoming divided. And the question is how we are going to manage within a rules-based system a more divided world. There's talk about friendshoring, there's talk about national defense, there's talk about restructuring the overall trade framework. It should be clear that the trade framework that has prevailed has not served our societies well. It was short-sighted. It didn't put enough attention to risk. There was excess dependence in Europe on Russian gas. Clearly, something I pointed out 15 years ago that was extraordinarily foolish, and now Europe is paying the price. But still, we need to cooperate. We live on one planet, and we need to cooperate not only in the area of trade, but most importantly in the area of climate change or dealing with the next pandemic, which will surely come along. And so one of the things that I hope the G20 and the T20 will discuss is how do we help develop a framework that will allow this kind of cooperation, even as the world becomes more divided between democracies and authoritarian regimes in the coming years. With those introductory remarks, open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. Really, thanks a lot for this broad overview and also for recalling us how important is cooperation despite these troublesome times we're living in. Let me ask you something more specifically on economy, inevitably, Professor Stiglitz, with you. Because, I mean, raising inflation, raising interest rates, are we really running the risk that a financial crisis is just around the corner, wherever it comes from, whether it is a developing country or in Europe, of course, there are the usual suspects. I will not mention anybody, but you can guess it. So what's your view on this, please?
Well, let me make two remarks. First, this inflation is largely caused by supply side problems, bottlenecks in chip manufacturing, shortages of food, shortages of oil as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a whole range of supply shortages. And these will not be solved by raising interest rates. In fact, they may be made worse because what we need to alleviate supply side shortages is investment, and raising interest makes investment more expensive. So one of the worries is that as central banks raise interest rates and inflation doesn't respond, they'll continue to raise interest rates to the level that they'll bring on a recession. And then we will have the worst of all possible worlds, inflation with an economic downturn. That kind of a problem is particularly of concern in those developing countries, emerging markets, and as you point out, some developed countries where there is high levels of debt. We know what happened the last time interest rates were raised very rapidly at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. We had the Latin American debt crisis. The World Bank, the IMF, all expressed concern about a looming debt crisis as a result of the pandemic, and that was before interest rates started to increase. With the triple whammy of high oil prices, high food prices, and high interest rates, the chance of a debt crisis in a number of countries, I think, is one that one has to take extraordinarily seriously. Unfortunately, the debt structure today is much more complex than it was in the beginning of the 1980s, at the time of the Latin American debt crisis. Then the debt was held in relatively few hands, concentrated in a few multinational banks. Today, the private debt is held in many, many hands, hedge funds, institutional investors. We have multilateral, bilateral loans, and a major new player with about a quarter of all the debt, China. And getting all these together to help restructure the debt, something that will have to happen, and eventually did happen in Latin America, but after a very long time and a lot of suffering in Latin America, it will be even more difficult to design a restructuring of that debt. In 2015, the UN, partly as a result of a recommendation of a commission that I chaired in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, came forward strongly, almost unanimously, in support of an international framework for debt restructuring. But unfortunately, a few of the creditor countries, including the United States and the UK, opposed, and nothing was done. So here we have a moment with a potential debt crisis, a very likelihood of a debt crisis, at least in some countries, and no framework for dealing with it. One of the things I hope that the G20 will deal with going forward is the creation of such a framework.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Now moving from economics to politics, so getting back to Ukraine. In March, you said that you agree with EU sanctions against Russia, but they were not enough, as Europe should stop buying Russian oil and gas as soon as possible. Now we're almost there. There is partial embargo on oil imports from Russia. But do you really think that the European Union can get rid of oil and gas imports from Russia with no serious consequences and no serious impact, at least in the short term, in the short to mid-term?
Well, the first point, when I made those remarks several months ago, I was concerned that if Europe didn't break off its relationship with Russia, Russia would choose a timing to, when it was most painful for Europe, to impose a partial or total embargo on Europe. And that has, to some extent, happened. So it would be far better for Europe to choose the time of and the manner of its moving away from its dependence on oil and gas from Russia. The second thing is, I think this is a moment for massive expansion of green energy. You know, to find fossil fuels, you have to drill, it takes time, but we know how to invest in green energy. We know how to invest in solar panels and wind, and we should have the capacity to expand that capacity relatively quickly. So I think this is a moment to make that kind of a commitment, which there has been a long-term commitment to move towards green. What we really need is a short-term commitment to move towards green very, very rapidly.
Thank you.
Finally, let me say that there should be more solidarity within the Western Alliance. And by West, I include countries like Japan and Australia, all the countries that are committed to democracy. This war against Russia is not just to protect Ukraine, but to protect democracy. We all have a stake in it. And because we all have a stake in it, we should all be bearing the economic cost. There should be a solidarity. Sure. So I think it would be a good thing if countries like the United States, where because we are neither an exporter nor an importer of oil, fossil fuels, if we made a contribution towards Europe to enable it to bear these costs better.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Now, you kindly accepted to have a question from a student of our ISPI Bocconi G20 Global Ambassadors program. Please, introduce yourself, pose your question, please.
Hi, my name is Fabio. I'm one of the G20 Global Ambassadors at ISPI. Thanks a lot for giving this insightful speech and also for giving me the opportunity to ask the question. My question is, you once said that inequality is not a destiny, but a choice. How can we avoid that today's young people become adults in a more unequal world tomorrow? Thanks a lot.
Yeah. What I meant when I said, of course, that inequality is a choice is that there were policies that we could enact that would change the face of inequality in our society. And in some ways, President Biden has provided in the aftermath of the pandemic a good example in the bill that helped rescue the US economy from the pandemic. There were provisions to help poor children. And in 1 year, we reduced the poverty rate for children by almost 50%, from an unacceptable level of about 20% to a still unacceptable level of 10%. And of course, this poverty is not only undermines American economy today and our society, but it also weakens our future. So I think what we have to do is to think more deeply about what are the causes of inequality and what we can do about it. And just to give you two examples of things that I think could be done, or three examples of things that could be done easily. We need a more progressive tax system. I mentioned during my talk the fact multinational corporations, many of them owned by some of the richest people in the world, and companies like Apple and Amazon excel not only in bringing products to markets, but also in avoiding their fair share of taxes. And putting the burden on the rest of society, even though they benefited enormously from the advances of technology that our governments have financed. But two other areas are, first, more equal educational opportunities. In many countries, those who are born of poor parents don't have the same access to education those born to more well-to-do parents. And more broadly, we have to, as I say, think comprehensively about the underlying sources of inequality and how to curb them. One of the sources of inequality is market power, monopoly power. Actually, monopoly power and market power are one of the sources of our current inflation. These firms have the power to raise prices well over their cost of production and to reap benefits even as the rest of our society pays an enormous cost. Increasing inequality now and inhibiting our ability to respond effectively to the Russian invasion. So it seems to me important for a whole variety of reasons that we have this kind of comprehensive attack against inequality.
Professor Stiglitz, unfortunately we have to stop here, but let me thank you sincerely really for your precious contribution to the Global Policy Forum. Wish you all the best. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I leave the floor again to Maria Cuffaro for next session.